On July 7, 1922, three men rented laboratory space near the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. They had $60,000 between them, a collection of borrowed equipment, and a name that meant nothing to anyone. 103 years later, the company that grew from that rented lab reported $80.8 billion in annual revenue, held a $218 billion backlog in future contracts, and employed more than 185,000 people across the world. That is not growth. That is transformation. Repeated, relentless, total transformation across a century that saw the world blow itself apart and rebuild itself twice. The number that frames this story is not 80 billion. The number is 268. $268 billion in contracted future work, sitting on the books as of the end of 2025. That is more than the annual gross domestic product of over 150 nations on Earth. Every missile that needs building, every jet engine that needs delivering, all of it, waiting in a queue that stretches years into the future. This is the story of how Raytheon, a company that began making radio tubes in a Cambridge laboratory, became the world's largest aerospace and defense corporation. It is a story of invention driven by war, of empire built through acquisition, of scandal absorbed and survived, and of a machine that has never stopped reinventing itself, because stopping would mean becoming irrelevant. And irrelevance, in this industry, is not a setback. It is a death sentence. Welcome inside the laboratories, factories and boardrooms, where a century of combat systems were born, tested, sold, and continuously reborn. 1922. Cambridge, Massachusetts. The city of Cambridge sits directly across the Charles River from Boston, pressed against the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In July of that year, the streets around MIT were dense with new graduates and restless engineers hunting for something to build. The air smelled of copper wire and machine oil. Vannevar Bush was 32 years old. He held a doctorate in engineering from MIT and Harvard. He would later become science advisor to President Roosevelt, architect of the American wartime research apparatus, and the man who effectively designed the modern relationship between the federal government and scientific research. In 1922, he was simply a professor with an idea and two partners. Lawrence Marshall was 31. He had studied engineering, spent time in business, and had the practical instincts to translate laboratory discoveries into commercial products. Charles Green Smith was the scientist of the group, a physicist whose earlier astronomical research of the star Zeta Puppis had produced an unusual piece of work, a gaseous helium rectifier tube that could convert household alternating current into a regulated direct current. Radios required direct current. Batteries were expensive, short-lived, and inconvenient. Smith's tube solved the problem. On July 7, 1922, the three men incorporated the American Appliance Company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The refrigeration idea they had originally discussed lasted approximately one meeting. Electronics were the real opportunity. The radio industry was exploding. Household electrification was accelerating across the United States. Every home that wanted a radio needed a reliable power source, and Smith's tube was the most elegant solution anyone had built. They named the tube Raytheon, a compound of Old French and Greek terms meaning light from the gods. The name captured something about what the tube actually did. It took the invisible power running through wall sockets and made it usable. It turned the abstract into the functional. In 1925, the company renamed itself Raytheon Manufacturing Company, formally cementing the tube's name as the company's identity. The early years produced a single disciplined focus: make the rectifier, sell the rectifier, improve the rectifier. By the end of the decade, Raytheon had become one of the dominant vacuum tube manufacturers in the United States, and the company that had started with $60,000 in borrowed capital and a physics paper about a distant star was generating millions in annual revenue. The numbers were assembling. The machine was learning what it was built to do. But the world was about to need something far more dangerous than a radio power supply. 1941. Waltham, Massachusetts. In the autumn of 1941, British scientists arrived in the United States, carrying one of the most consequential pieces of hardware the war would produce: the cavity magnetron. It was a specialized vacuum tube the size of a large coffee can, capable of generating microwave energy at frequencies precise enough to detect enemy aircraft and submarines at ranges and accuracies that previous radar systems could not approach. The British had the design. They did not have the manufacturing infrastructure to produce it at scale. The Americans did. The United States government turned to its electronics manufacturers. It turned, first among them, to Raytheon. Percy Spencer was Raytheon's chief engineer. He had been born in Howland, Maine in 1894, orphaned before his second birthday, raised by an aunt and uncle, and compelled to leave grammar school at 12 years old to work at a spool mill. He had joined the Navy at 18 and taught himself trigonometry, calculus, chemistry and physics from textbooks during night watches. He was, by the time the war began, one of the most capable production engineers in the United States, a man who understood not just how a piece of technology worked, but how to make thousands of them work simultaneously and reliably. In 1941, magnetron production across the Allied forces stood at 17 units per day. Spencer studied the device. He eliminated precision copper bars and replaced them with laminated components. He replaced soldered internal wires with solid rings. He rebuilt the production process from the ground up. The result? 2,600 magnetrons per day. By the time the war ended in 1945, Raytheon had manufactured approximately 80% of all magnetrons built for the Allied war effort. The company ranked 71st among American corporations by value of wartime military production contracts. A company that had been making radio rectifiers 20 years earlier was now a foundational element of the Allied military machine. The factory at Waltham was transformed. The workforce expanded. The contracts multiplied. And in the middle of that wartime production frenzy, something happened that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with the future. Percy Spencer walked past an active radar set. A chocolate bar in his pocket melted. The next chapter of Raytheon's story began, unexpectedly, with popcorn. Cambridge, Massachusetts. The candy bar that Percy Spencer noticed melting in his pocket was a payday bar. Peanuts and caramel held together by a thin chocolate shell. Spencer noticed the melting and did not dismiss it. He set up an experiment with unpopped popcorn kernels held near the magnetron. They popped. He tried an egg. It exploded. He constructed a metal enclosure with a door, directed the magnetron's output into it, and observed that the enclosed microwave energy heated food rapidly, evenly, and through materials like wax paper, glass, and plastic that would not conduct heat in a conventional oven. On October 8, 1945, Raytheon Manufacturing Company filed a United States patent for Spencer's microwave cooking process. 2 years later, in 1947, the company unveiled the Raytheon, the world's first commercially available microwave oven. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, weighed 750 pounds, consumed 3 kilowatts of power, required water cooling, and cost between $2,000 and $3,000. In today's money, that figure sits between $29,000 and $43,000 per unit. The Raytheon was tested in a Boston restaurant. For 20 years, the device remained an industrial curiosity. Too large, too expensive, too much infrastructure required for domestic use. The breakthrough came when Raytheon acquired Amana Refrigeration, incorporated in 1965. Amana had consumer distribution channels, manufacturing experience with household appliances, and brand recognition in American kitchens. In 1967, using the Amana name and the accumulated 20 years of Raytheon development, Raytheon released the first countertop household microwave oven. It fit on a kitchen counter. It cost $495. Within 2 decades, it would sit in more than 90% of American homes. But the microwave was a detour, not a destination. The company's fundamental logic was always military electronics, and the post-war years confirmed it. By 1948, Raytheon had begun manufacturing guided missiles. Its Lark missile, the SAM-N2, became the first such weapon to destroy a target aircraft in flight in 1950. The air-to-air Sparrow and the ground-to-air Hawk followed. The pattern was established, and it was permanent. Raytheon was not an appliance company that made weapons. It was a weapons company that for a time also made appliances. The numbers were about to get much larger and the products much more lethal. 1962. Waltham, Massachusetts. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced that the United States would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The following year, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology received the first contract awarded for the Apollo program, the design of a guidance, navigation, and control computer small enough, light enough, and reliable enough to fly 2 astronauts from the Earth to the lunar surface and back. MIT designed it. Raytheon built it. The Apollo guidance computer was manufactured at Raytheon's factory in Waltham, Massachusetts. It weighed 70 pounds. It occupied less than 1 cubic foot of space. It contained approximately 73 kilobytes of memory, less computing power than a modern household toaster. Every single one of its memory circuits was hand-woven by women at the Waltham factory, many of them former employees of New England textile mills. The code, written by teams at MIT's instrumentation laboratory, was literally woven into the hardware, using copper wires and magnetic cores the size of small beads. A wire through a core represented the number 1. A wire around it represented 0. The women at Raytheon wove the ones and zeros of the entire flight program by hand, strand by strand. The work required such precision that during a brief strike in the mid-1960s, managers and supervisors attempted to keep the production line running by doing the weaving themselves. According to Ed Blondin, a senior manager at the facility, everything they made was scrap. On July the 20th, 1969, the Apollo guidance computer, manufactured at Raytheon's Waltham factory, guided Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to a landing in the Sea of Tranquility. No Apollo guidance computer ever failed during a mission. Raytheon built every Block I and Block II unit. The production run consumed more than 1 million individual integrated circuit chips. The space program was both a technical triumph and a financial signal. Raytheon was not simply a missile maker or a radar manufacturer. It was a systems integration company capable of executing the most precise, most consequential guidance technology the world had ever produced. That capability would define the company's trajectory through every decade that followed. But here's what the ledgers were already showing by the late 1960s. The pure commercial ventures were not the engine. The engine was always defense contracts. The question was how big that engine could get. 1991. Andover, Massachusetts and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The Patriot missile system had been in development since the 1960s, cycling through program names including LTAMDS, AADS, 70, and SAM-D, before finally entering service with the United States Army in the early 1980s. By January of 1991, Patriot batteries were deployed across Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Gulf War had begun. On January 18, 1991, less than 24 hours after the coalition's initial airstrikes, Iraqi forces launched modified Scud missiles into civilian areas in Saudi Arabia where American forces were deployed. Patriot batteries fired their interceptors. The Raytheon-built missile defense system had achieved the first-ever wartime engagement of a ballistic missile in recorded history. On February 15, 1991, President George Herbert Walker Bush traveled to Raytheon's Patriot manufacturing plant in Andover, Massachusetts. Standing before the workers who had built the system, he declared, "The Patriot is 41 for 42. 42 Scuds engaged, 41 intercepted. A claimed success rate above 97%. The factory workers, many of whom had worked double shifts for months, heard the President of the United States tell them their product had changed the course of modern warfare. The reality, as congressional investigators would later examine, was more contested. Independent analysts testified before the House of Representatives in April of 1992 that actual intercept rates may have been significantly lower than the administration claimed. MIT's Theodore Postol and Tel Aviv University's Reuven Pedatzur argued the true figure could be below 10%. Raytheon and the Army disputed those analyses vigorously, citing an overall success rate above 60%. What was not in dispute was the commercial result. The Gulf War transformed the Patriot from a defense procurement program into a global brand. Germany, The Netherlands, Israel, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, South Korea, and Taiwan all purchased the system. By the mid-1990s, Raytheon had generated $2.4 billion in foreign Patriot sales alone. The system's combat exposure, regardless of the contested intercept numbers, had made it the most recognized missile defense product in the world. The numbers at this moment were at their most obscene in a particular way. A single weapons system, built in a factory in Andover, Massachusetts, was generating billions in global sales. The acquisition wave that followed would make even those numbers look modest. 1995 through 1997, Lexington, Massachusetts. In a consolidating defense industry, size was not merely an advantage, it was survival. Lockheed had merged with Martin Marietta in 1994 to form Lockheed Martin. Boeing had absorbed McDonnell Douglas. Northrop had taken Grumman. The industry was collapsing into a small number of massive primes, and any company that did not move aggressively risked being absorbed or rendered irrelevant. Raytheon's chairman and chief executive Dennis Piccard chose a different path. He chose to acquire. In 1995, Raytheon purchased Dallas-based E-Systems for $2.3 billion. E-Systems was a signals intelligence and reconnaissance firm that brought classified capabilities Raytheon did not possess. The following year, Raytheon absorbed Chrysler Corporation's defense electronics and aircraft modification businesses for approximately $455 million. Then, in 1997, came two acquisitions that together restructured the entire company. The first was the defense business of Texas Instruments. The Defense Systems and Electronics Group, purchased for $2.95 billion in cash. Texas Instruments' defense division brought advanced precision-guided munitions technology, including the AGM-65 Maverick missile program, and critical radar component manufacturing. The Department of Justice required Raytheon to divest Texas Instruments' monolithic microwave integrated circuit production capacity as a condition of approval. The second acquisition, completed in December of 1997, was the aerospace and defense business of Hughes Aircraft Company, purchased from Hughes Electronics Corporation, a subsidiary of General Motors, for $9.5 billion. Hughes brought satellite sensors, electro-optical systems, the former General Dynamics missile business, the defense division of Delco Electronics, and Magnavox Electronic Systems. The combined entity became the number 3 defense contractor in the United States. Dennis Piccard stated publicly that their strategy had been to remain a top-tier company in a consolidating industry. The acquisitions had achieved that. Raytheon's annual revenues crossed $20 billion. Its defense electronics revenues alone reached $14.5 billion. The company now held dominant positions in missiles, radar, sensors, and precision guidance, the 4 pillars of modern precision warfare. The acquisition machine had built an empire in 36 months. The question was whether that empire could be governed effectively. Then something nobody wanted to name out loud started appearing inside the financial reports. 1998 through 2003. Lexington and Waltham, Massachusetts. The 1997 acquisitions created a company of extraordinary capability and extraordinary complexity, integrating 3 major defense businesses simultaneously. E-Systems, Texas Instruments Defense, and Hughes Aircraft required merging incompatible systems, cultures, workforces, and classified programs. The integration costs were severe, the timeline was aggressive, and the late 1990s defense environment was not the growth market the acquisitions had anticipated. Federal defense budgets in the late 1990s were under pressure. The Cold War dividend, the expectation that military spending would remain elevated, had not materialized in the way defense primes had projected. Raytheon's stock price, which had traded above $60 per share in 1997, fell sharply as integration costs mounted and revenue growth disappointed. By 1999, the company had recorded significant charges and restructuring expenses. The Hughes acquisition in particular had carried with it environmental liabilities at the acquired Tucson, Arizona plant site, where the Environmental Protection Agency had ordered groundwater treatment for contamination with chlorinated solvents traceable to operations dating to 1951. William Swanson became chief executive in 2003. inheriting a company that had survived the acquisition wave but had not yet fully absorbed it. His mandate was stability, discipline, and recovery. Between 2003 and 2014, Swanson rebuilt financial performance year by year. Revenues grew from approximately $18 billion in 2005 to $25 billion in 2017. Employee count stabilized around 63,000. Operating margins improved. The company divested consumer businesses, Amana Refrigeration, the commercial laundry division, and refocused entirely on defense and government electronics. In 2014, Thomas Kennedy succeeded Swanson as chairman and chief executive. Kennedy had spent his entire career at Raytheon, rising through the missile systems division. His focus was modernization, positioning the company for a new generation of precision warfare defined by directed energy, cyber systems, and hypersonic threats. By 2018, Raytheon held annual revenues of approximately $25.35 billion and employed 67,000 workers worldwide. More than 90% of those revenues came from military and government contracts. The company had returned, completely, to its fundamental identity. The problem was already visible to anyone who looked. 90% exposure to one customer, the government, meant that when that customer demanded more, everything expanded. And when it demanded accountability, everything was examined. June 2019. Hartford, Connecticut, and Waltham, Massachusetts. United Technologies Corporation was not a small company. It owned Pratt & Whitney, the jet engine manufacturer whose engines powered some of the most significant military and commercial aircraft in the world. It owned Collins Aerospace, a massive avionics and aircraft systems business formed by the 2018 acquisition of Rockwell Collins for approximately $30 billion. It owned Otis Elevator and Carrier Air Conditioning. It was a diversified industrial conglomerate, with revenues above $60 billion and a legacy stretching back to the founding of Pratt & Whitney Aircraft Company by Frederick Rentschler in 1925. In June of 2019, United Technologies announced it would merge with Raytheon Company. Before the merger could be completed, United Technologies spun off Otis and Carrier as independent public companies, leaving only the aerospace businesses, Pratt & Whitney and Collins Aerospace, to combine with Raytheon. The combined company was initially valued at more than $100 billion, positioned to become the world's second-largest aerospace and defense company by revenue behind Boeing. The merger closed on April 3, 2020. The combined entity took the name Raytheon Technologies Corporation and began trading on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker RTX at $51 per share. Gregory J. Hayes, the former United Technologies chief executive, became chairman and chief executive of the merged company. Raytheon's former campus in Waltham became the initial headquarters, though the company subsequently relocated its corporate headquarters to Arlington, Virginia, in 2022. The merger created 4 business segments: Collins Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney, Raytheon Intelligence and Space, and Raytheon Missiles and Defense. The combined workforce stood at approximately 174,000 employees, including 58,000 engineers. The physical footprint included 235 manufacturing, production, and overhaul facilities around the world. In July 2023, the company simplified its name to RTX Corporation and consolidated Raytheon Intelligence and Space and Raytheon Missiles and Defense into a single Raytheon business segment. The result: 3 divisions: Collins Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney, and Raytheon, each one a major defense and aerospace enterprise in its own right. But here's what the ledgers were already showing in 2023, while the new brand was being unveiled. A criminal investigation had been quietly progressing for years. Meanwhile, in a federal courthouse in Brooklyn, New York, the evidence was accumulating. October 16, 2024. Washington, D.C., and Brooklyn, New York. Between 2009 and 2020, Raytheon Company had been engaged in a pattern of conduct that federal investigators characterized, in formal legal language, as a major scheme to defraud the United States government. On October 16, 2024, the Department of Justice announced the resolution. Raytheon agreed to pay more than $950 million. The settlement covered three distinct categories of misconduct. The first was defective pricing. Between 2009 and 2020, Raytheon had knowingly failed to provide truthful certified cost and pricing data during negotiations on numerous Department of Defense contracts. This violated the Truth in Negotiations Act, a law enacted by Congress in 1962, specifically to prevent sole-source defense contractors from manipulating data during contract negotiations where there was no competitive pricing to constrain. Behavior. Raytheon admitted it had misrepresented labor and material costs, overcharged the United States government by $111 million in connection with Patriot missile systems and radar services, and billed the same costs twice on at least one contract. The Civil False Claims Act settlement totaled $428 million, the second largest government procurement fraud recovery under that statute. A former Raytheon employee named Karen Atasoglu had filed a whistleblower lawsuit that was instrumental in driving the investigation. She received $4.2 million as her share of the recovery. The second category was foreign bribery. Between 2012 and 2016, Raytheon employees had paid bribes to a high-ranking official in the Qatar Emiri Air Force to secure lucrative defense contracts in that country. The payments, totaling more than $32 million over a broader period to a Qatari agent, who was related to the country's emir, had been disguised through sham subcontract arrangements. Raytheon had continued working with the agent despite multiple internal employees flagging corruption risks. The company paid approximately $300 million to resolve these charges. The third category was export control violations. In August of 2024, separately, RTX had agreed to pay $200 million for unauthorized exports of defense technology to China, Russia, Iran, and other nations, resolving more than 750 violations of the Arms Export Control Act. As part of the October 2024 settlement, Raytheon agreed to 3 years of independent monitoring of its compliance program. The number that ended this chapter, $950 million. October 2024 through May 2025, Arlington, Virginia. In the weeks after the $950 million settlement was announced, RTX Chief Executive Christopher T. Kallio, who had assumed the role in May of 2024, succeeding Gregory Hayes, issued a formal statement. The company acknowledged the misconduct. It acknowledged that the conduct had occurred at Raytheon Company, largely before the 2020 merger. It pledged cooperation with the newly appointed independent monitor, and it committed to improving what it called its ethics and compliance program. Kallio was a Pratt & Whitney veteran. He had spent his entire professional career inside the businesses that now made up RTX. His appointment had come during one of the most difficult operational periods in recent RTX history. Not only because of the legal investigations, but because in late 2023, Pratt & Whitney had disclosed a contaminated powder metal defect affecting the discs of its geared turbofan jet engines. The defect had required the accelerated inspection and grounding of approximately 600 commercial aircraft worldwide. RTX stock had fallen into the mid-$70 range. The commercial aviation side of the business, which normally provided a stabilizing counterweight to defense cyclicality, was suddenly generating its own crisis. The number measuring the damage, $1.24 billion in reserves that RTX had already set aside by early 2024 to cover the anticipated legal settlements, funds held in anticipation of a reckoning the company knew was coming before it arrived. What followed was a disciplined recovery. The geared turbofan remediation program moved forward methodically. Kallio communicated directly with airlines and regulators. The financial cost was substantial, but bounded. The compliance overhaul at the defense business was implemented under monitor supervision. Internal controls were strengthened. By the end of 2024, RTX had reported adjusted sales of $80.8 billion, up 11% organically from the prior year. Adjusted earnings per share had risen 13%. Every one of the 3 business segments had expanded margins. The company returned $3.7 billion of capital to shareholders. Here is what the silence in that boardroom meant after the compliance failures. Not that the company was broken, but that the machine was large enough to absorb a settlement of merely $1 billion and still grow 11% in the same calendar year. The problem was already visible to anyone who looked, and so was the recovery. January 2025. Arlington, Virginia. In January of 2025, RTX Corporation announced the results of its fourth quarter and full year 2024 financial performance. The revenue figure, $80.8 billion, was notable. The backlog figure was extraordinary, $218 billion. Of that amount, $125 billion represented commercial aerospace contracts, engine maintenance agreements, avionics service contracts, supply agreements with Boeing and Airbus. $93 billion represented defense contracts. And throughout the year, RTX had received more than $112 billion in new contract bookings, meaning it was adding new business faster than it was delivering on existing commitments. The defense portion of the backlog had increased 19% year over year. The driver was geopolitical. In Europe, NATO members accelerating modernization following Russia's invasion of Ukraine were ordering Patriot systems, advanced radar equipment, and precision munitions at rates not seen since the Cold War. Poland had committed approximately 5% of its gross domestic product to defense, the highest level in NATO at that time. Germany had authorized an emergency defense fund of €110 billion. RTX CEO Chris Kallio noted on the earnings call that the company had more than 30 defense systems actively in use in combat operations worldwide. The Patriot system, the same product whose Gulf War success rate had been debated in congressional hearings in 1992, was now being used operationally by Ukraine against Russian ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and advanced fighter aircraft including Su-34 and Su-35 jets and Mi-8 helicopters. By 2023, Ukrainian Patriot batteries had intercepted Russian Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, a weapon Russia had publicly described as unstoppable. Raytheon's Andover, Massachusetts facility, where President George Herbert Walker Bush had stood before factory workers in 1991 and praised the Patriot, was operating at capacity and planning expansion. The factory that had built the original Patriot interceptors was now building the lower-tier air and missile defense sensor, or LTAMDS, the next-generation radar designed to replace the Patriot's aging sensor architecture with gallium nitride-based active electronically scanned array technology capable of providing 360-degree coverage against ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones and hypersonic glide vehicles simultaneously. In August of 2024, the Army awarded Raytheon a contract valued at more than $2 billion to deliver LTAMDS radars for the United States and Poland. The backlog kept growing. October 15, 2025. Andover, Massachusetts. On October 15, 2025, Raytheon broke ground on a $53 million, 23,000 square foot expansion of its lower-tier air and missile defense sensor production facility in Andover, Massachusetts. The building going up on that site was not replacing an old building. It was being added to an already active factory that had been manufacturing missile defense systems since the 1980s. The new expansion would increase capacity for LTAMDS production specifically. Tom Laliberty, president of Land and Air Defense Systems at Raytheon, stated that the investment was driven by growing global demand for the system. More than a dozen countries had already requested information and received classified capability briefings. Poland had signed as the first international customer in 2024. In September of 2025, Raytheon signed an agreement with Polish defense firm WZE to supply energy storage modules for LTAMDS, making WZE the first international supplier in the program's production chain. The LTAMDS system itself represented a generational leap from the Patriot radar it was designed to supplement and eventually succeed. The original Patriot radar, built in the 1980s, used a fixed-beam phased array that could cover a 90-degree sector. LTAMDS uses 3 active electronically scanned arrays, 1 primary and 2 secondary, providing full 360-degree coverage with no gaps. The primary array alone delivers greater detection range and discrimination capability than the complete Patriot radar. The system uses gallium nitride semiconductor technology rather than the gallium arsenide components of previous radar generations, producing higher power output with lower thermal generation. In September of 2025, the United States Army awarded Raytheon a $1.7 billion contract to deliver 9 LTAMDS radars for domestic and Polish use. The Army had designated LTAMDS a formal program of record in April of 2025, the military's highest level of programmatic commitment, meaning the system was fully funded and integrated into long-term acquisition planning. By late 2025, RTX's total backlog had grown further, to $268 billion. For every dollar that had left the company through legal settlements and compliance remediation, multiple dollars had arrived through contracts signed by allied governments who needed the next generation of defense capabilities. But here's the thing. The factory in Andover tells you where all of this is going. 2025 through 2026, Arlington, Virginia, and 35 countries worldwide. RTX Corporation's financial performance for the full year 2025 recorded $88.6 billion in revenue, a 10% increase over 2024's already record-breaking total. Adjusted earnings per share reached $6.29. For 2026, management guided to revenue of between $92 and $93 billion, with adjusted earnings per share between $6.60 and $6.80. The company's research and development spending in 2024 had reached $2.93 billion, 3.55% of total revenue, directed toward hypersonic air-breathing cruise missile technology, artificial intelligence integration in avionics, and targeting systems, autonomous collaborative systems, and next-generation propulsion for the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan platform. In 2025, the company partnered with Shield AI to develop networked collaborative autonomy systems, autonomous platforms capable of real-time combat coordination without continuous human input. Collins Aerospace was engaged in electrification programs under the European Union's Clean Aviation Initiative, developing hybrid propulsion systems for next-generation regional aircraft. The structure of RTX in 2026 looked nothing like the structure of Raytheon in 1922, and yet the logic was continuous. The company that had found its first commercial success by making radios easier to power had spent a century following a single principle. Identify where technology intersects with strategic necessity, build the most capable version of that intersection, and sell it to the people who most urgently need it. Radio rectifiers in 1922. Radar magnetrons in 1941, guided missiles in 1948, microwave ovens in 1967, moon landing computers in 1969, Patriot interceptors in 1991, precision-guided munitions in the 1990s, hypersonic defense radars in 2025. By 2026, more than 30 RTX defense systems were actively deployed in combat operations across the globe. The company held 52,000 patents. It employed more than 185,000 people across 180 countries. Its 3-digit NYSE ticker, RTX, was one of the most widely held institutional equity positions on Earth. The factory in Andover was still running. The factory in Tucson was still running. The factory in Waltham, where women had hand-woven the memory of the Apollo guidance computer, had long since been repurposed. The work had moved on to the next target. It always does. On July 7, 1922, 3 men incorporated a company with $60,000 in borrowed capital. In 2025, the company they founded reported $88.6 billion in annual revenue and held $268 billion in contracted future work. Run the arithmetic. The revenue multiple is more than 1,400,000 to 1. That number has 3 implications stated plainly. First, the defense industry does not contract. It accumulates. Every war, every threat, every geopolitical shift adds contracts and capability requirements faster than old contracts expire. Raytheon survived the post-Cold War drawdown, the post-Gulf War plateau, the post-9/11 surge, the post-Iraq and Afghanistan rationalization, and the post-2022 European rearmament. Each cycle added more capability, more customers, more contracts. The $268 billion backlog is not a snapshot, it is a structural condition. Second, the price of operating at this scale is the systematic production of misconduct. The $950 million settlement in 2024 was not aberrant. It was the output of an organization so large, so deeply embedded in opaque sole-source government contracting, that misrepresenting costs and paying foreign bribes were activities that could persist for over a decade before external pressure produced accountability. The compliance overhaul underway in 2025 and 2026 is real. Whether it is sufficient is a question that will be answered in the next investigation, not this one. Third, the technology does not stop. The Patriot that entered service in the early 1980s is still in production. The LTAMDS that began replacing its radar in the early 2020s is in production and being exported. The hypersonic air-breathing cruise missile program, the autonomous collaborative combat systems, the next-generation propulsion platforms, all of it is in development. Funded by the backlog, driven by the same logic that drove Percy Spencer to mass-produce magnetrons in 1941. Return to the opening number. On July 7, 1922, 3 men started with $60,000. 103 years later, the machine they started is signing $112 billion in new contracts in a single calendar year. Not restructuring, not declining, not managing legacy, signing $112 billion in new work in a single year, with $268 billion waiting behind it. The factory in Andover is still pouring concrete. The balance sheet does not lie. This is not the conclusion of the story.